Hey everybody, welcome into Folklore and Flourish. You're here with Jane today at Blue Box 29. It's been a long week. We've been doing a lot of cleaning up around the house, getting rid of stuff, looking at land, working on our book. So I haven't been here the past few days, but I promise it's worth it because our book is coming along nicely. I'm very excited about it, and I'm actually going to work on a few more chapters after this. But anyways, today is July 13th. This entire week has been about the divine kingdoms. We are looking at the month of gods and titans. We're at the very beginning, and our archetype is the divine witness. We are in week 2, like I said. It's all about the divine kingdoms. We've heard a number of very fun stories today, as well as people who are in charge of certain kingdoms, as well as others who can travel across kingdoms. And today, July 13th, is all about the guardians. Our theme is the threshold keepers. So we are all about the access being protected today, and we're going to see that through Chinese, Norse, African, and Hindu folklore today. We're going to be seeing some of my favorites today. This is a really good day. And then we're going to place an object at a doorway today to mark the boundary between what may enter and what must remain outside. So we're going to place something in our boundary today and put intention behind it. What kind of things do you want to be welcomed into your house? What kind of things do you want to stay out? And then we're going to honor the limits that safeguard what matters most today. We're going to honor those limits. But the final thought that I'm going to leave you with today is actually the question of the day. What must be protected? So in a lot of the stories today, we are going to see the things and beings that protect and how they protect, what their duties are. And you're going to think about in your life, what must be protected in your life, both internally as well as the people around you, perhaps, or the ideas around you. And anyways, I'm just so into our book right now. I'm so excited to get back to it. So I'm going to let you guys go. I will see you tomorrow. I will be back tomorrow, I promise, for July 14th as we see the Wrath. I'm excited for the Wrath because it has one of our big characters from our book tomorrow. So of course I'll be here. But anyways, I hope you have been having a great week, and I hope you continue to have a great rest of week 2 with the Divine Kingdoms. Make sure you like, subscribe, leave your comments below, reach out. Yeah, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to honor the cultures behind the stories we are about to explore. The tales shared here come from many peoples, lands, and traditions. I do not change these stories to fit modern expectations or to align with today's social standards. Instead, I present them as they were told, sometimes beautiful, sometimes harsh, sometimes challenging. We are not here to judge the past, but to understand it, to listen, to learn, and to honor the ancestors who carried these stories forward. We also share stories from various religious traditions. These are presented in their historical and spiritual context, with respect for their beliefs that they represent. Every culture deserves respect, context, and acknowledgement, and this space is dedicated to doing exactly that. Story 1. The Door Gods Who Guard the Threshold. During the reign of Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty, the emperor began to hear terrible sounds outside the doors of his sleeping chamber. Night after night came the scraping, howling, and restless cries of spirits. And though the palace was filled with servants and soldiers, the disturbances returned whenever darkness fell. The emperor could not sleep, and as the nights passed, his strength began to fail. Among those who heard of his suffering were 2 of his greatest generals, Qin Jiang and Yu Qi Gong, warriors whose courage was already known throughout the realm. They offered to stand guard outside the emperor's chambers themselves. That night, the 2 generals took their places at the doors, fully armed and dressed for battle, one standing on either side of the entrance. Qin Jiang carried his weapons and watched one side of the threshold, while Yu Qigong guarded the other, and through the long hours of darkness neither abandoned his post. For the first time in many nights the palace remained quiet. No spirits approached the chamber, no terrible sounds disturbed the emperor's sleep. When morning came, Taijiang had rested peacefully, and so the generals returned the following night. Again they stood before the doors, and again the spirits did not come. Night after night the two warriors kept watch, but the emperor knew that even his strongest generals could not remain forever outside his chamber, while their other duties waited. He ordered artists to paint the likeness of Qin Qiang, Yu Qigong in their armor and weapons, capturing the fierce presence that had driven the spirits away. The images were placed upon the two halves of the palace doors, one general facing the other across the threshold, and when darkness returned, the spirits still did not enter. The painted guardians had taken the place of the living men. From the emperor's chamber, the practice spread beyond the palace. Images of armed protectors appeared upon gates and household doors, especially in pairs, watching the boundary between the safety within and whatever might approach from outside. They became known as Munshan, the door gods, divine guardians whose place was not deep inside the home but directly upon the entrance itself. Other figures could also serve as door gods in different regions and traditions. And older Chinese customs of protecting entrances existed long before the Tang dynasty. But Qin Jiang and Yu Qigong became among the most famous paired guardians. Their images were renewed for the new year, when old pictures could be removed and fresh ones placed upon the doors, restoring the watch for another year. One guardian stood upon each side because the threshold had two directions. The doors opened outward toward roads, strangers, spirits, weather, fortune, and danger, but they also opened inward toward the family, ancestors, food, sleep, children, and the private life of the household. The door gods stood between those worlds. They did not close the entrance forever, because a house with a door that never opened could receive neither guests nor blessing. Instead, they guarded the place where entry became a choice. Long after the two generals had finished their first night of watch, their painted forms remained at the threshold. Weapons ready, eyes turned toward whatever might come. The warriors no longer needed to stand outside the emperor's chamber. Their images had learned to keep the door. Story 2. Heimdall and the Breaking of Bifröst. At the edge of Asgard, where the burning rainbow bridge Bifröst joined the realm of the gods and the world beyond, Heimdall kept watch. He was called the White God and was said to be the son of 9 mothers, 9 sisters, who bore him at the borders of the world. His dwelling, Beard, stood near the place where Bifröst reached the heavens, and there he guarded the road into the stronghold of the Aesir. Heimdall required less sleep than a bird. By night he could see as clearly as by day, and his sight reached 100 leagues in every direction. He could hear grass growing upon the earth and wool growing upon the backs of sheep, and no enemy could approach the bridge without risking the notice of the god who listened at its end. Beside him rested Gjallarhorn, the great horn whose sound could be heard throughout all the worlds. But Heimdall did not raise it for every traveler who crossed the bridge. The gods themselves rode over Bifröst together at their councils, and the bridge remained their road between worlds, burning with fire so that the frost giants could not easily pass. Heimdall watched because the gods knew that one day an enemy would come across, whom even the bridge could not hold. When Ragnarok began, the old bonds of the world broke apart. The wolf, Fenrir, tore free. The Midgard serpent rose from the sea, and the ship, Naglfar, was loosed upon the waters carrying the enemies of the gods. From the south came the sons, Muspel, led by the fire giant Surtur. And as they rode forward beneath a sky filled with destruction, they reached Bifröst. The rainbow bridge that had carried the gods between worlds could not bear the force of the host crossing upon it, and Bifröst broke beneath them. Heimdall saw the enemies coming. Then, after ages of waiting, he lifted Gjallarhorn and blew. The sound traveled through the world and awakened the gods to what had arrived. Odin sought counsel before the final battle. The Aesir armed themselves, and the powers of the world gathered upon the field of Vigrithr. Heimdall left his watch at the bridge and went to battle. For once the enemy had crossed the threshold. The guardian's place was no longer beside the gate. Among the forces gathered against the gods was Loki, who had once moved among the Aesir, but now came with their enemies. Heimdall and Loki met upon the field, and there the two ancient opponents fought one another. Heimdall killed Loki, and Loki killed Heimdall, each bringing about the death of the other as the old world fell around them. The guardian, who had spent the age of the gods listening for the approach of danger, did not prevent Ragnarok, because even the greatest watchman could not forbid what fate had already set in motion. His task was to see it coming, for as long as the road into Asgard could be guarded, Heimdall remained beside it. When the bridge finally broke and the enemies crossed, he sounded the horn that told every world the threshold had fallen. Story 3. The Sacred Pythons of Wida. Long before the sacred pythons lived within their temple at Wida, the people of the region remembered a time of danger when enemies pursued them, and survival depended upon finding a place their attackers could not reach. In the tradition often told of the sacred serpents, the people fled until they came to a great forest and sought refuge among its trees. There, as the enemy drew near, pythons appeared. The serpents did not strike the people who had entered the forest, nor did they drive them from their hiding place. Instead, they surrounded and concealed them, forming a living barrier between the fugitives and those who hunted them. The enemy could not pass, whether frightened by the serpents, unable to find those they pursued, or driven away by the power believed to dwell among them. The attackers withdrew and the people emerged alive. From that time, the python was remembered not as a creature to be hunted, but as a protector. The serpent became sacred, and its descendants were treated as living beings under divine protection. In Wida, the sacred python came to be associated with Dongbe, a serpent power honored within Woden tradition, and living royal pythons were kept at the temple dedicated to the python. They were not statues placed before the sanctuary to represent guardians who lived elsewhere. The serpents themselves moved through the sacred space. They coiled in cool chambers, crossed the temple grounds, and sometimes left the enclosure entirely, slipping beneath walls and wandering into the streets and homes of the city. When one was found outside the temple, it was not treated as an intruder. The python could be returned carefully to the sanctuary, for the animal belonged to a sacred order older than the walls that contained it. To deliberately kill one was forbidden. The pythons were harmless to humans, but their protection did not depend upon fangs or venom. Their power came from the relationship remembered between the serpents and the people who honored them. The temple stood near other sacred places in Wida, a city shaped by many layers of history, kingship, trade, conquest, Woden practice, and later the terrible passage of enslaved people toward the Atlantic. Yet within the temple grounds, the old guardians remained. Generations of individual snakes lived and died, but the sacred presence associated with them continued. A guardian did not need to be the same body forever. The protection belonged to the lineage, the place, and the promise remembered between human beings and the beings that had once sheltered them. The people had entered the forest seeking refuge and had been allowed to pass among the serpents unharmed. Their enemies had not. From that remembered distinction came a sacred bond. The python became a creature that could cross boundaries humans usually kept closed, between wilderness and settlement, temple and street, animal and divine presence. Doors might be shut against ordinary creatures, yet a sacred python wandered through Wida, could be received, lifted carefully, and carried home. For the serpent had once guarded a people when there had been no gate, no wall, and no warrior left between them and danger. The forest itself had become their sanctuary, and the pythons had kept the threshold. Story 4. Nandi and the King Who Could Not Pass. Upon the heights of Mount Kailash, the great god Shiva dwelt with Parvati, far above the kingdoms of men and the roads upon which ordinary travelers moved. The mountain was not a palace whose gates opened to every ruler who arrived with wealth, armies, or a famous name. It was the dwelling of the god, and before those who approached could pass into his presence, they encountered Nandi, the sacred bull and devoted attendant of Shiva. Nandi was more than the animal upon which the god rode. He was the guardian of Shiva's dwelling, the leader of his attendants, and the one who remained at the threshold between the outer world and the presence of the deity. In time, there came toward Kailash the mighty Ravana, lord of Lanka, whose strength and learning were matched only by the pride that grew beside him. Ravana had conquered kings, defeated enemies, and traveled through the world with the confidence of one who had grown accustomed to finding no boundary strong enough to resist him. Yet when he reached Kailash, his passage was stopped. Nandi stood before him and told him that Shiva and Parvati were within, and that Ravana could go no further. The king of Lanka did not accept the refusal with humility. He looked upon the guardian and mocked his appearance, laughing at Nandi's face and comparing it to that of a monkey. Nandi heard the insult and pronounced a curse. One day, beings with the faces and forms Ravana had mocked would help bring about the destruction of his power. Ravana dismissed the warning, If the guardian would not permit him to cross the threshold, then he would not ask again. He would remove the threshold itself. The king descended to the base of Kailash, stretched his many arms beneath the mountain, and began to lift. The earth trembled, the mountain shook. Those who dwelt upon Kailash were alarmed as the ground moved beneath them, and even Parvati was disturbed by the force rising through Shiva's sacred dwelling. But Shiva did not summon an army. He did not descend the mountain to meet Ravana in battle. He pressed one toe downward. Beneath that effortless weight, Kailash settled upon Ravana and trapped him below it. The king, who had believed he could lift the dwelling of a god, found himself pinned beneath the mountain he had tried to move. Ravana cried out in pain, and his roar shook the worlds, but the mountains did not release him. There he remained, unable to escape by strength alone. At last, the pride that had brought him to the threshold began to change. Ravana turned toward Shiva not with mockery, but with praise. He sang hymns to the god and performed devotion for a vast span of time, and Shiva, eventually pleased by his worship, released him. In later tradition, Ravana's terrible cry beneath the mountain became connected with the very name by which he was known, and the proud king left Kailash carrying both Shiva's favor and the curse spoken by the guardian he had insulted. Much later, when Ravana carried Sita away to Lanka and brought the events of the Ramayana toward war, it was an army of Vanaras, monkey-like forest beings, who joined Rama in the struggle against him. Among them was the great Hanuman, whose strength, devotion, and journey to Lanka helped make Ravana's defeat possible. The words spoken at the gate of Kailash had traveled farther than Ravana understood. He had laughed at the guardian because he mistook appearance for weakness, and he had tried to move the mountain because he mistook refusal for a challenge to his strength. Yet Nandi had never needed to defeat him. The guardian had only needed to hold the boundary. Ravana himself did the rest. He mocked what stood before him, reached beneath the sacred mountain, and discovered that the gate he could not pass was protected by something greater than a wall. Daily Thread for July 13th. Across the doors of China, at the burning bridge of the Norse gods, among the sacred pythons of Wida, and before Shiva's dwelling upon Mount Kailash. Today's stories remind us that every sacred place has a boundary, and every boundary raises the same question. What should be allowed to enter? The Chinese door gods stood upon the threshold after living warriors could no longer keep watch through every night. Their painted forms guarded the place where the outside world met the safety of the home. Heimdall watched beside Bifröst with eyes that could see for 100 leagues and ears that could hear grass growing, knowing that one day the bridge would break and his task would not be to prevent the inevitable, but to recognize its arrival and sound the warning. In Wida, the sacred pythons, remembered in oral tradition, became living guardians after serpents protected people when no wall or warrior stood between them and danger, turning the forest itself into a sanctuary. And at Mount Kailash, Nandi refused passage to Ravana, holding the boundary even when the king mocked him, threatening the mountain and believing his own strength should grant him access to any place he wished to enter. Though these guardians kept watch beneath different skies, none of them existed because everything outside the threshold was evil. Doors must still open, bridges must still be crossed, forests must still shelter the lost, and sacred spaces must still receive those who approach them rightly. A guardian does not exist to seal the world away forever. A guardian exists to know the difference between what may enter and what must remain outside. Perhaps this is why the oldest stories place guardians at doors, bridges, forests, temples, mountains, and the borders between worlds. Every life contains places that cannot survive without protection. The home, the body, the mind, the heart, the work we are building, the people entrusted to us, and the quiet inner spaces where something sacred is still becoming. As tonight's fire settles into glowing embers, consider this. What am I guarding? What part of my life have I been called to protect? And have I mistaken protection for building a wall no one can cross, or openness for leaving every door unguarded? Perhaps the deepest question is not whether we should have boundaries, but whether we know what they are protecting, what they are keeping out, and what we are still willing to open the gate for when the right thing arrives.